sole living soul in a smallpox wagon train. A cowboy burned the wagons and gave her a clean home. The rifle was still warm when I set it down. Not from firing. I hadn't fired it. Warm from being carried 2 miles through the October cold, pressed against my side all the way up the creek bed, because I didn't know yet what I was riding into, and a man out here who doesn't know what he's riding into had better have something warm in his hands. What I found wasn't shootable. 7 wagons, pulled into a loose arc along the south bank of Pincher Creek, the way a train does when it stops for the night and means to be there a while. Canvas covers, most of them. One had the cover half torn away, flapping in the wind off the flats, slow, heavy like a flag at a funeral. The oxen were gone. Every one of them gone. Either cut loose by somebody with sense, or wandered off when whoever cut them loose stopped being able to tend them. The grass around the wagons was trampled to mud and then frozen in place, like a record of panic nobody was left to read. I'd been trailing this outfit for 3 days. Not following them, I want to be exact about that. I'd picked up their track on the road north from Garfield's Crossing, and I was going the same direction they were going, that's all. Heading up to winter at my brother's place near the Marias. Had no intention of catching up with them, no particular reason to. A wagon train is a wagon train, families mostly. Somebody's mother-in-law in the back of the 3rd wagon, some farmer's boy walking beside the wheel because he's 16 and can't sit still. I'd waved at enough of those outfits over the years. Meant nothing to me. Then 2 days back, the track changed. Hard to say exactly what I noticed first. The way the oxen were moving, maybe the prints going off-drew, stumbling wide in the mud. Then no campfire smoke on the 2nd night where there should have been. Then the silence of the thing. You can feel a wagon train from a mile away if they're healthy, somebody coughing, a child, a dog barking at nothing. There was nothing. By the morning of the 3rd day, I knew something was bad wrong. And a man who knows something is bad wrong and keeps riding away from it isn't a man I'd want to eat supper with. So I turned toward the creek. I smelled it before I saw it, that particular sweet trot smell that has nothing good mixed in with it. I'd smelled it before once during the war, once at an army post on the Yellowstone where a Crow family had come in sick in the summer of '72. I knew what it was. I pulled my bandana up over my nose, which does approximately nothing, but you do it anyway because it gives your hands something to do. The first wagon I checked had 2 people in it. A man and a woman, both of them gone, both of them marked with the pox. I backed away without touching anything. 2nd wagon, a family of 4, all gone. 3rd wagon, a young man maybe 20 years old, dead, sitting up against the wheel with a Bible open in his lap. The pages were moving in the wind. I worked my way down the line, 6 wagons, 14 people by my count when I was done, all of them gone, some recent, some not. The last wagon I came to was set slightly apart from the others, pulled up close to the creek bank under a stand of cottonwoods. The canvas was tied down tight on this one, and there was something different about it. A crate of supplies beside the rear wheel, recently opened. A tin cup sitting on the crate, a little water still in the bottom of it, not yet frozen solid. I stopped, stood there a minute. Then I called out, not loud, didn't need to be. The flats were silent except for the wind. I said, anybody in there? Silence, then the canvas moved. Not the wind, something deliberate, a hand from inside pushing at the bottom hem of the canvas. Slow, like whoever it was had been saving that movement for a while and wasn't sure they had enough left to make it. I said, I'm not sick, I'm alone, you can take your time. The canvas came up, a woman's face looking out at me from maybe 6 inches of gap, dark-ringed eyes, hair matted and loose. She was pale the way a person gets pale when they've been running a fever for days and it's finally broken and left them wrung out, not the pallor of sickness still on her, but the pallor of the aftermath, the hollow. She looked at me for a long moment without saying anything, and I looked back, and I could see her trying to figure out what I was, threat, stranger, ghost of some kind. I took the bandana off my face so she could see me plain. She said, are they all dead? Her voice was rough from disuse, asking a question she already knew the answer to. I said yes. She closed her eyes, stayed like that for a few seconds. Then she opened them again and looked at me with a steadiness that I won't soon forget in a woman who'd been through what she'd been through. She said, then I'm all that's left. Her name was Clara Marsh, 26 years old. Traveling with her father's family, her father, her uncle's wife, and 3 children, and the other families on the train who'd thrown in together at Garfield's Crossing headed north. The sickness had come on fast, the way it does. Her father was the first to go 4 days back. By the second day, she was the only one still on her feet. She'd done what she could, carried water, tried to get broth into people, sat with them. But there are things a person can't outrun, and she hadn't been able to outrun this one. She just hadn't caught it herself, which isn't something a person earns. It's just luck. It's just the way the sickness moves, takes some, leaves others, and there's no prayer or virtue in the difference. I helped her down out of the wagon. She could stand, but barely. I put my coat around her and got her away from the wagons, 20 yards, 30, upwind, and sat her down on a rock by the creek and gave her water from my canteen and the last of a piece of jerked beef I had in my saddlebag. And while she ate, I thought about what needed to be done. The thinking didn't take long. There was really only one answer. I said, I'm going to burn the wagons. She looked up at me, all of them. All of them, everything in them. It's the only way to be sure. I watched her face. She was working through it, the grief of it, the practicality of it. Her father's things were in one of those wagons. Photographs, maybe, whatever a family carries. I didn't say any of that, didn't need to, she already knew. She said everything. Everything. She looked back at the wagons for a long moment. The flapping canvas on the one with the torn cover. The Bible still open in the young man's lap, pages moving. I watched her make the decision, watched it settle in her face, that particular kind of stillness that comes when a person accepts a hard thing. She said, all right. I said, I'll do it right. Say whatever you need to say first. She stood up, which took some effort, and she stood there looking at the wagons from a distance for what I'd guess was 5 minutes. Didn't cry, didn't speak. I don't know what she said inside herself to the people in those wagons, to her father. That's not my business, and I wouldn't say it if it was. When she turned back to me, she had that same steadiness in her face. She nodded once. I got to work. I'd carried a tin of coal oil in my pack since the Yellowstone, one of those habits that saves your life about once every 5 years and costs you nothing to keep. I used about half of it on the first wagon, built the fire from the canvas and the dry goods crates inside, let it take before moving on, kept Clara well back and upwind. The fire spread fast once it got going. The wagons were dry, the wood old and seasoned by months on the trail, and there was enough wind to carry the flames from one to the next once I'd touched the others. It took about 40 minutes. I stood there and watched it burn, and I thought about the people in those wagons, which is what you do. You can't not do it. You think about the fact that they were alive 2 weeks ago, going somewhere, had some idea of what next spring was going to look like, and now they're not. It doesn't benefit anything to think about that, but you do. Clara came and stood beside me when the last wagon was fully gone, close enough that her shoulder was almost touching my arm. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We just stood there until the fires burned down to coals, and then I kicked dirt over the worst of the embers and we walked away from what remained. Now here was the problem. She had nothing. Whatever she'd had was in those wagons. The clothes on her back, her shoes, the shoes were falling apart. I noticed that when I helped her walk. Her family was dead. The nearest town of any size was a 2-day ride south, back toward Garfield's Crossing, and that was the wrong direction for winter. The cold was coming hard, and Garfield's Crossing wasn't set up for a woman alone with no money and no kin. North was my brother's place, and I had one horse. I had one horse, and I had a woman who could barely stand. I didn't spend much time deliberating about this. A man who deliberates too long about a thing like that isn't built right. I put her on my horse. I walked. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't looking for anybody. Wasn't looking for a woman, wasn't in the market for a companion. I've been alone for a long time, 4 years since my wife Alina passed. 4 years of moving around, working other men's spreads, not putting down much in the way of roots because roots require a reason and I hadn't found a sufficient one. I was 53 years old, carrying about 10 years' worth of hard miles on top of that, and I had made a kind of peace with a solitary life the way a man makes peace with a bad knee, not happy about it, but done arguing. But a man doesn't leave a woman alone in the middle of the Montana Territory in October with no shoes and no kin, and that's all there was to it. Wasn't noble. Was just the only option that I could live with. We made about 8 miles that first afternoon. I led the horse and Clara rode, and she slept in the saddle, which tells you how worn out she was sleeping upright on a moving horse, the cold wind off the flats coming right at her face. I kept checking on her. Kept watching the color come and go in her face and wondering if she was going to take sick after all. She didn't. She just slept. We camped that night in a coulee out of the wind with a fire small enough to be useful but not so big it called attention to itself. I had coffee and dried beans and a little salt pork. Not much. Enough. Clara ate slowly, carefully, the way a person eats when their stomach has been empty long enough to be suspicious of filling. I didn't push conversation. Didn't seem like the time for it. After she'd eaten, she said, "Where are we going?" I said, "My brother runs a spread on the Marias, about 60 miles north and a little west. He'll take us in for winter." She looked at the fire. She said, "I don't know your name." That stopped me. I'd been with this woman for most of a day and I hadn't told her my name. "I don't know what that says about me." I said, "Caleb Das." She said, "Clara Marsh." And then, like she remembered I already knew that, "You already know that." I said, "I do." She almost smiled. Not quite. She said, "Are you sure your brother won't mind having a stranger?" I said, "Walt's got 6 kids and a wife who feeds people like it's a competitive event. One more won't register." This time she did smile, just barely, just for a second, and I had the thought, and it was only a thought, nothing I'd have said aloud, that she had a fine face when she smiled. Plain, maybe, to some people's taste. Strong jaw, wide-set eyes, the kind of face that looks like it's been outside and doesn't apologize for it. I liked it. I turned back to the fire and left it at that. We rode for 3 days. I walked most of it. On the second day she was strong enough to help, insisted on gathering firewood when we made camp, insisted on doing something with the beans at supper that made them taste considerably better than they had when I'd been making them. She had strong opinions about coffee, it turned out, though she was polite about it. She said, "You've been making it wrong." And then she showed me how, and she was right, though I wouldn't have admitted it at the time. She was careful with her strength those first 2 days. I could see her rationing it, doing a thing and then sitting down, not because she was weak exactly, but because she was smart about it. She knew what she had, and she knew not to spend it all at once. That told me something. A person who's been truly close to the edge knows what their resources are in a way that a person who's always had plenty doesn't. She'd been close to the edge. She came back from it without making a performance of either the going or the coming back. The nights were the hard part, cold enough that sleep was work. I had 1 blanket, and she had the one from my bedroll that I'd given her on the first night. And on the second night the temperature dropped hard around midnight, and I woke up with the fire down to nothing and the cold sitting on my chest like a stone. I built the fire back up and sat close to it and didn't go back to sleep. She woke up a while later and found me there, and she didn't say anything dramatic. She just moved her blanket over and laid it across both of us, and we sat there by the fire until the cold backed off a little toward morning. It wasn't intimate in any way I mean to be coy about. It was practical. Cold is cold. But I'm telling you the true version of things, and the true version is that I was aware of her beside me in a way I hadn't been aware of a person in a long time. We talked some, not a lot, not the anxious filling up of silence that some people do when they're uncomfortable. She wasn't that kind. She talked when she had something to say. She told me about her father, a farmer from Illinois who'd had an idea about land in Montana and had spent 3 years saving up for the journey. She said he'd been excited about it, genuinely excited, right up to the end, had been talking about the land, where he was going to run his fence lines, what he was going to plant in spring. She said that was the part that was the hardest to put down, not the grief of losing him, though that was real enough. The grief of the interrupted hope, the thing he'd been working toward that had gotten so close. I said, "He got close, that counts." She was quiet for a minute, then she said, "Maybe." She was looking at the fire, and I could see her working through it, the math of what's close enough and what isn't, whether almost reaching a thing is worth something or just another flavor of not reaching it. I didn't push it. There are questions a person has to answer for themselves in their own time, and this was one of them. I told her about a leaner. Didn't mean to, it just came out, the way things sometimes do when you've been alone with someone long enough that the silence changes quality. Just said I'd had a wife and she'd passed 4 years back. Fever. 3 weeks from healthy to gone. Clara didn't say she was sorry, which I appreciated. She just nodded like she understood the particular arithmetic of that kind of loss, which she did now, God help her. She said, "Were you happy?" Meaning before. I said yes, we were mostly. She said, "That's something." I said, "It is." On the 3rd afternoon we came over a ridge and Walt's place was below us. The house, the barn, the corrals, smoke coming out of the chimney stack, cattle in the near pasture. It looked like the most substantial thing I'd seen in days, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Walt was at the barn when we rode in. He took one look at us, me on foot, this unknown woman in the saddle, the general condition of both of us, and he didn't ask a single question. He just said, "Get inside." "Martha's got food on." That's Walt, never wasted a word in his life. Martha had food on. She had Clara in a warm room with a basin of hot water and clean clothes within about 20 minutes of our walking through the door, and she had me eating soup at the kitchen table inside of 5. And I will tell you honestly that the soup might have been the best thing I'd ever put in my mouth, which tells you something about the preceding 3 days. Clara slept for 14 hours that first night. I slept for about 10, which for me is an extravagance. Walt and I talked the next morning. I told him everything, the wagon train, what I'd found, what I'd done. He listened without interrupting, which is a rare quality in a man. When I was done, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "You did right, Caleb." Just that. I wasn't looking for absolution, wasn't sure I needed it. The wagons needed burning, and I burned them, and that was the sum of it. But it meant something to hear Walt say it. He said, "She's staying the winter." I said, "She's got nowhere else to go right now." He nodded like that settled it. He said, "Then she stays. Martha'll put her to work and she'll earn her keep, no charity about it." I said that sounded fine. What I hadn't reckoned on was the winter itself. The Maria's country in winter is no joke. The cold comes down off the north like a wall, weeks at a stretch where the temperature doesn't get above 0, and you're burning wood around the clock just to keep the house livable. Walt's place was solid and well-provisioned, which is why I wintered there and not somewhere else. But there's still the hunkering down quality to it. Everybody under the same roof, same 600 square feet of living space, day after day of cold and dark with nowhere to go. Clara folded herself into that household like she'd been in it for years. She was good with Walt's kids, patient with the little ones, matter-of-fact with the older ones in a way they responded to. She helped Martha with the cooking and the mending and the 1,000 small tasks that keep a family functioning in winter. She wasn't cheerful about it in a performed way. She just worked, quietly, steadily, without complaint or commentary. She had her hard days, too. There were mornings I could tell she'd been awake in the night, that particular flatness behind the eyes, the way a person carries themselves when they've been somewhere dark and come back and are not going to mention it. I didn't press. Grief is private. She knew I knew, and that was enough. Once, a Sunday in December when the cold was particularly bad and everyone was inside all day and the light went gray and flat by 2 in the afternoon, I found her standing at the east window of the main room looking out at nothing in particular. She had her arms folded, not cold. The house was warm, just holding herself. I went and stood beside her. We looked out the window together for a while, didn't say anything. After a few minutes, she took a breath and went back to what she'd been doing, and she gave my arm a brief press with her hand as she passed. That was all. It was something. I watched her, couldn't help it. When you're in a house that size with somebody, you notice things. I noticed that she was always the first one up in the morning, had the coffee on before anyone else was stirring, which she made correctly, as she had informed me. I noticed that she talked to Walt's youngest, a boy of 4 named Thomas who was a shy child and didn't speak much, more than she talked to anyone else, not baby talk, just regular talk like he was a person, which he appreciated. Thomas started following her around within the first week. She pretended not to notice, but she'd leave whatever she was doing and go slow when he was trailing her so he could keep up. I noticed that. I noticed a lot of things. I noticed that when something difficult happened, a cow got through the fence in a hard snow, Walt came in with a cut hand from a saw blade. She moved toward it, not away. That's not nothing in a person. A lot of people move away from hard things by instinct and don't even know they're doing it. She was the opposite. She'd been through enough that hard things didn't surprise her, and so she could go right at them without that half-second hesitation that costs you when it counts. I tried not to read too much into any of it, told myself I was observing. Told myself it was the ordinary kind of noticing that happens when a group of people are cooped up together in close quarters. Told myself a lot of things. About a month in, Walt pulled me aside after supper one night. He has a way of doing this, just catches your eye and angles his head, and you follow him out to the barn because you know something is coming. I followed him out. He checked on the horses, which is what he does when he's thinking, runs his hand along the neck of the nearest one and looks at the wall. He said, "You know she lost everything." I said I knew that. He said, "She's all right, Caleb. I'm just telling you, in case you needed telling." I looked at the horse for a while. I said, "Walt." He said, I know. Just saying what I see." I said, "What do you see?" He shrugged, patted the horse's neck. He said, "The way she watches the door when you're out." I didn't have an answer for that. I went back inside and sat by the fire and thought about what Walt had said, which was an extremely short conversation that somehow managed to take up most of the rest of my evening. The thing happened in January. The worst cold snap of the winter, 4 days where the temperature was somewhere around 30 below, and nobody was going outside for anything but necessity. Walt's oldest boy, a 14-year-old called Eli, had been fighting a chest cold, and on the 3rd day of the cold snap it turned bad. Fever spiking, rattling cough, Martha white-faced in the way a mother gets when she's watching her child and not able to calculate the odds. Clara took over. I don't mean that dramatically. She didn't push Martha aside or announce herself. She just did. She had Walt bring snow in to pack around Eli's feet to bring the fever down. She had Martha make a poultice from whatever she could find in the kitchen, mustard mostly, and they put it on his chest. She sat up with him through the night, the first night, while the rest of us slept in shifts. At 3 in the morning I came to take over from her, and she was sitting beside the boy's bed, her hand on his forehead, not doing anything particular, just there. Present, keeping watch. I said she should get some sleep. She said she would in a while. I sat down on the other side of the bed. We sat there together in the lamplight with Walt's boy between us, breathing hard but breathing, and outside the temperature was God knows what, and the house creaked with the cold. She said quietly, not to wake the boy, "I keep thinking about them, on the wagons." I knew what she meant. She said, "I kept watch with them, I did what I could, but there wasn't," she stopped. "There wasn't enough of me to go around." I said, "No." She said, "You did what you couldn't not do, burning the wagons. You just saw what needed doing and you did it." I said, "So did you. You sat with them, that's what needed doing then." She was quiet for a while. The boy's breathing eased a little, the poultice working, or just time passing. She said, "Thank you for turning toward it when you found us." I thought about what to say to that. I said, "There wasn't really a choice." She looked at me, not a quick look, a real one, steady and direct, the same look she'd given me through that 6-inch gap of canvas on the first day. She said, "There was. I've been thinking about that for 2 months. You could have kept writing. Most men would have." I said, "I don't know about most men." She said, "I do." I didn't have a response to that either. I looked at the boy. His color was better, I thought, better than an hour ago. She said, "Caleb," first time she'd used my name. I said, "Yeah." She didn't say anything else for a moment. Then she reached across the bed and put her hand over mine, the way you'd do with a friend or something more than a friend. Her hand was warm from the lamp and still, and she left it there a few seconds, and I didn't move. She said, "You're a good man." I'm going to tell you that I didn't know what to do with that. 53 years old, and I did not know what to do with 3 words said quietly in a lamplight room at 3 in the morning over a sick child. I kept my hand where it was. I said, "Get some sleep, Clara. I'll watch him." She took her hand back slowly and stood up and went to the door, and then she stopped. She said, without turning around, "In the spring, when the ground's clear, I'd like to go back there, to Pincher Creek, and say a proper word over what's left." I said, "I'll take you." She turned then and she looked at me across the room and she said, "I know you will," and she went to bed. Eli broke the fever the next morning. Martha cried and grabbed Clara and held her, and Clara stood there and let herself be held, and over Martha's shoulder she looked at me with this expression I can't quite put into words, part exhausted, part something else, something quieter. Like a person who has come back to solid ground after a long time in uncertain water. I nodded at her. She nodded back. Walt came and stood beside me. He was looking at Clara too. He said quietly, "What I tell you." I said, "Walt." He said, "Just saying." The rest of the winter passed. The cold stayed but got manageable. There were good days. Walt's kids found a long frozen slope behind the north pasture, and we spent half a Sunday afternoon watching them slide down it on a piece of barn wood. And Clara laughed at that, really laughed, and it was the first time I'd heard her do it, and it was a good sound. There were harder days, nights when the wind came down something awful, and you'd lie awake listening to the house and wondering about the cattle. There was the ordinary accumulation of winter days, which sounds small and isn't. We talked more as winter went on. She told me about Illinois, what it was like growing up on a farm, her father, the particular flat quality of the landscape there, the way the light was in summer. She had a good memory for physical detail, for the feel of things. Told me about the smell of her father's barn in the morning, the sound the corn made in a wind. I told her about the years after a leaner, moving around, working different spreads, the way a man can get comfortable with drift if he's not careful. She listened without judgment, which was more than I deserved, and then she said, "Where would you want to be if you were putting down roots?" I said, "Here maybe, the Maria's country, land's good up here." She said, "Have you said that to Walt?" I said, "Not in so many words." She said, "You should." I didn't tell her the part that was true, which was that the idea of putting down roots had been feeling more real to me all winter than it had in 4 years, and that the change had something to do with her. I didn't say that. I worked up to it in my head every couple of weeks and then put it away. A man like me doesn't say a thing like that to a woman who's still carrying fresh grief. You wait. You let time do what it does. You earn the right to say it. March came in hard and went out soft. The thaw started in the first week of April, tentative at first, a day of sun, a day of gray, a freeze overnight and then warmer again, the world coming back to itself. By the third week of April, the ground was clear enough to travel. I had a roan mare of Walt's I'd been riding through the winter. He'd offered to sell her to me, and I'd been meaning to settle the deal. I settled it. I had a good horse and a second one we'd use as a pack. I built a pine box, small and plain, for putting anything we found at Pincher Creek that wanted burying proper. I packed 3 days of supplies. Clara was ready before me on the morning we left. She was standing by the horses when I came out of the barn in a coat of Martha's that fit her better than mine had, her hair pinned back under a gray hat. She had the look of someone who has set her face toward a hard thing and means to go through it. She looked capable, settled in herself, like the woman I'd first seen through the gap in the canvas, but with the aftermath of winter added to her, which had done her no harm. I came up and checked the pack horse's load. She watched me work. She said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" I said I would. She said, "I know. I'm asking if you want to. There's a difference." I stopped what I was doing and looked at her. I said, "Yes, I want to." She looked at me for a second, and then she reached up and straightened the collar of my coat, just adjusted it, the way you'd do for somebody you were comfortable with, somebody close. Her fingers on the lapel for a second, then gone. She said, "All right then, let's go." We rode out while Walt's kids were still asleep. The ride to Pincher Creek took 2.5 days. We went easy, no rush about it. The country was coming alive, green at the edges of things, cottonwoods putting out their first leaves, the creek running high and cold with snowmelt. It was good country. I've been in a lot of country, and this was as good as most of it. We talked the whole way. Not anxiously, not filling silence, just talked, the way people who have gotten comfortable with each other talk. She asked me about the war, which most people don't ask because they don't want to hear the answer. I told her what I was willing to tell, which was more than I usually tell. She asked good questions, not the ones about the famous parts, the battles, the names, but the smaller ones. What did you eat? What did the officers sound like? How did you know when something was about to happen? Those questions, the ones that are actually about what it was like to be a man in that situation, not what it looked like from outside. I'd talked to men who'd been there, obviously, but not many women asked those questions, and the ones who did usually flinched when you answered, which stops a conversation dead. Clara didn't flinch. She just listened, and when I was done with a thing she said, "Then what?" and meant it. I told her more than I'd told anyone in years. She told me more about her father, too, on that ride. What he was like when he was happy, laughing, easy, she said. Told a story on himself before he told one on anybody else. She said he was the kind of man you wanted around when things went wrong because he'd already thought 3 steps ahead. She said he would have liked me. I said I was glad to hear it. She looked at me when I said it, a quick sideways look, and I understood what the look meant and let it stand. The country coming out of winter was something. I've ridden that stretch of Montana in every season, and April is the one that earns its keep most. The grass coming green at the edges of the road, the creeks running high and loud with snowmelt, the smell of the ground thawing that you can't mistake for anything else. Clara rode beside me on the second horse, and she noticed all of it. She was someone who noticed the world around her and didn't need to perform the noticing, just took it in. Once she pointed at something in the sky and said, "First red tail I've seen since fall." I looked. There it was, circling above the ridge, riding the thermals up. We both watched it for a minute before it went over the ridgeline and was gone. Small things, but small things are what a life is made of. We came to Pincher Creek late in the afternoon of the second day. The wagon circle was ash and char. The cold winter had scattered most of it, and the spring melt had run through it, and what was left was low and blackened and already starting to be reclaimed by the grass. The cottonwoods above the bank were leafing out. The creek ran clear. We stood at the edge of what had been the circle for a while without speaking. Then Clara walked into it. She moved through the ash slowly, stopping here and there, looking at the ground, paying attention. I stood back and let her have it. After a while she went to where the last wagon had been, the one she'd been in, and she stood there with her hands folded and her eyes closed, and she spoke to her father and her uncle and the others. Not out loud to me, not performing, just to them, quietly, her lips moving. When she was done, she looked up and found me with her eyes across the ash circle, and she held that look for a moment, and then she walked back to where I was standing. I had the pine box ready. We went through what the winter had left, not much at all, and we put what wanted burying into the box with care. She put in a piece of a lady's comb, the teeth still intact, and a tin button that she turned over in her fingers for a long time before laying it in. I put in a buckle, the kind that fastens a Bible strap. We buried the box at the edge of the cottonwoods above the flood line where the ground was soft and the trees would shade it in summer. I dug the hole. She stood by. When I was done, we stood together over it, and she said, clear and level, "They were good people. They deserved better. They are remembered." That was all. It was enough. We camped that night on the high bank above the creek, away from the sight of the wagons, but close enough to the cottonwoods to hear them. The fire was small. The sky was clear. The temperature dropped hard after dark the way it does on a plains night even in April, and we moved our bedrolls a little closer to the fire and a little closer to each other, and neither of us made any remark about that. She said after a while, looking at the fire, "What will you do in the summer?" I said, "Talk to Walt about some ground. There's a piece up here, north face of the ridge above the home spread. Good grass, good water. A man could do something with it." She looked at the fire. She said, "A man alone." I said, "I've been thinking about that." She didn't say anything. She knew what I was working toward, and she was going to let me work toward it in my own time, which is the kind of patience that a good woman has and a less sure one doesn't. I stared into the fire for a while. I'm not a man who says things easily, never have been. But sitting there in the dark above Pincher Creek, after the winter we'd had and the days we'd just come through, it seemed wrong not to say it. Some things get worse with waiting. I said, "I'm asking if you'd consider staying, Clara, not out of circumstance, not because you've got nowhere else to go, because I'd like you to be there, because this winter has been—" I stopped, tried to find the right words, which is not my strong suit, "because having you there changed what the place feels like, what I feel like." She was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. The cottonwoods moved in the dark. She said, "Say the rest of it." I looked at her. She was looking at me straight and level, the way she always did, that look she'd had since the canvas, waiting for the thing I wasn't quite saying. I said, "I'm asking if you'd be my wife." She looked at me for a long moment. The fire was between us, and the light moved across her face. Then she leaned forward and put her hand to the side of my face, just her palm against my jaw, still and warm. And she looked at me with an expression that I think about sometimes, still think about it, when I want to remember what it feels like to have somebody look at you like you're the answer to a question they'd stopped hoping would get answered. She said, "Caleb, I stayed past December because I wanted to, you know that." I said, "I was hoping that was what it was." She said it was what it was. She kept her hand where it was, palm against my jaw, her eyes on mine. She said, "Yes, I'll be your wife." I put my hand over hers. We stayed like that for a moment in the firelight, above the creek where I'd found her and she'd been the last one left. And the cottonwoods moved in the night above the place. We just buried what needed burying, and none of it was small and none of it needed saying. We were married in June, on Walt's front porch, with his 6 kids in a row and Martha in her good dress, and a circuit preacher named Greer who smelled of tobacco and spoke plain. The land I'd had my eye on came to me that fall, after Walt and I worked out a price and I put 3 months of labor toward it. It was everything I'd thought it would be: the grass, the water, the long view south toward the Marias. I built the cabin on the high ground out of the flood plain, the way a man builds when he's building something meant to last. Clara had opinions about where the windows should go. She wanted the east window bigger, she said, for the morning light. I made it bigger. She was right about the morning light. She was right about most things. I got used to that. I don't tell this story often. Don't know that I've told it straight through like this before. You get to a certain age and you look back at the shape of things, all the turns, all the stretches of road, all the places where it could have gone different, and sometimes the shape surprises you. I could have kept riding that October morning north on the Marias Road with the wind at my back. I've thought about that. There would have been another winter somewhere else, another ranch, another set of borrowed years. Instead, I turned toward the creek. Clara says that's what she thinks about too sometimes. That moment, me coming back along the creek bed with my bandana on my face and my rifle in my hands. She says she heard me coming and she thought, whoever this is, they're the last chance. She didn't say that to scare me. She said it because it was true, and she figures truth is worth saying even when it's not comfortable. She's right about that too. The east window's good in the morning. She was right about that. The light comes in low and warm and hits the table where she's already put the coffee on and started whatever she's started. And I come in from the first chores of the morning, and there she is. And I will tell you plainly, a man who did not think he would get this again. There's a kind of love that doesn't ask anything soft of you. That sees you as you are, the hard parts and the worn parts and the years on you, and says, This is the one I choose. I'd have told you 4 years ago that I'd had that once in my life, and that was more than most men get, and I was grateful for it and done. Clara didn't ask me, she just stayed. Did the work, showed me what she was, and waited for me to see what she was doing, which took me longer than it should have, but she was patient. I like to think I earned it. All those years of moving around, all the spreads, all the solitary winters, all the times I did the thing that needed doing because it needed doing and there was nobody else to do it. I like to think that counted toward something. That the man who turned toward Pincher Creek that October morning had been built out of all of those years, all of those choices, and that's why he was the right man for the job. Maybe that's a thing a man tells himself. Or maybe it's just true. Either way, the coffee's on, and the window's right, and she's there. That's enough.